The episode starts with a startled Childen as he wanders around his store. While working on his display case, he sees a reflection in the door. Childen obviously hasn't forgotten about the Yakuza who had pointed a gun at his head. As he has flashbacks of the shootout with the Yakuza, he drops the glass clasped in his hand. Frank soon comes to check after he hears the noise of glass shattering. As they talk about the incident, Frank realizes that Ed might also be having a hard time. He then goes to confront Ed, who reveals his alliance with the Kemperadai as an informant. In the following scene, Tagomi sits in his alternate reality at the back of his living room. His son, Noriyuki, shows a film projecting the explosion of an atomic bomb. Noriyuki mentions that the bomb is more powerful than the one dropped on Nagasaki, a news broadcast announcing the negotiation with Russia over the Cuban Missile Crisis. In New York, Juliana goes to fetch Henry Collins and alerts him that his wife, Lucy Collins, has been taken to the hospital, but it turns out it was all but a trap to force him to betray the Nazi Reich in exchange for his pregnant wife's safe release. George Dixon holds a gun in his hand and threatens Henry to obey their orders. When Henry doesn't listen to the command, George tells him to do it for the sake of his child. Juliana returns home and turns on the television. An episode of American Reich starts to play. The news station quickly cuts in. Henry reports that Hitler has died, and the Reich has been lying about his condition. It is later revealed that the resistance forced Henry to report the news. Soon after, the resistance kills Henry on air during the broadcast. Smith immediately gets an update about the recent incident. Although the Nazis know that the resistance was behind the television confession, they aren't sure of the details. In a phone call, the newly appointed Chancellor Martin Huseman orders Smith to take care of the situation. Smith assures his superior that he will get the perpetrators under control. While the resistance in the Pacific states is reorganizing plans, Frank has something else in his mind. Since they struggle with the bombing plan, Frank gets up and suggests he should be the bomber of the Kempeitai headquarters. He wants to take his revenge on Kaido for killing his sister and her kids. That's why he doesn't care about dying. The show cuts to the new Chancellor, Martin Huseman, as he gives a public statement about Hitler's death. Huseman stands stoically in front of two swastikas and says that Hitler was, in fact, poisoned. Back in New York, Thomas visits Juliana at her apartment. He wants to learn more about his last episode in the church. It turns out that Thomas has been looking up his symptoms in the library. He tells Juliana that he knew his parents had been lying about his disease. Juliana, unsure of what to tell, sends the boy home to his parents. Later, it is revealed that the camera in Juliana's room has recorded her conversation with Thomas. In the alternate universe, Tagomi shares with Juliana that he has never been this happy before but has some obligations to fulfill elsewhere. Tagomi bids a tearful goodbye, takes the film and transports back to the real world, which is on the brink of war. Later, Tagomi encounters the finance minister, who is also a traveler from an alternate reality. The finance minister has his arms all burned when he was in Nagasaki during the bombing. When he was in the hospital, he had discovered that not only could he escape the pain of his burns by traveling to another reality, but he could also be with his family who had survived in this reality. In the meantime, the resistance and the Nazis are at war. The latter gather around their men and devise some tactical plans. After Smith and his team discuss about the resistance, he receives a message to go to the video control room. Smith is nervous because he thinks something might have happened back home. As he puts on the headphones, he discovers the conversation between his son and Juliana. Afterwards, Smith anxiously calls home, but Helen hasn't seen Thomas. He then confiscates the videotape as soon as his assistant notifies him that no one else saw or knew about the incident. In the Pacific states, the resistance finalizes their bombing plan. Everything about the plan seems to be fine, but Frank is suddenly shaky when he learns that he has to drive Sarah into the Kempeitai building as a part of the plan. The resistance wants Frank to pretend as Sarah's chauffeur, and Sarah to be General Onada's niece. As Frank and Sarah pull up to the gate of the Kempeitai headquarters, they wait for a long time since the guards thoroughly check Sarah's identity. They discover that the general hasn't requested to see his niece or any girl, but Sarah quickly manages to intimidate the guard, and they are finally allowed to enter. Frank nearly runs over a young mother and her daughter, who is headed toward the building, but it doesn't stop them from continuing their plan. Frank and Sarah execute their plan properly without any major hitches. They park their car with the bomb in the parking structure. When they try to escape, they are stopped at a checkpoint. Inspector Kaido then spots Frank at the front and comes down the stairs. Since the inspector has instantly recognized Frank, all their cover is blown. After Frank and Kaido stare at each other for a few moments, Frank shoots Kaido and wounds him. Sarah also pulls out her gun and assists Frank in firing the surrounding officers. As Tagomi approaches the Kempeitai headquarters to speak with Kaido about stopping the war, The building explodes. As the smoke clears, Kaido collects himself and puts on his glasses. His sergeant Yashida lays feet away from him, crushed under the rubble of the blast. Outside the headquarters, an infuriated Tagomi witnesses the wreckage of the bombing. The dreamy version of Dream a Little Dream plays as a bus drives over the Golden Gate Bridge. Head and Childen look out the bus window as they flee from San Francisco. Meanwhile, a rising smoke covers the cityscape. In the next scene, the show captions on December 11, 1945. It then takes us to the flashback of the Smith family. John Smith and his wife, Helen Smith, enter a small apartment. Suddenly, there's a blinding light outside as dark clouds form over the city. As the Smiths look outside their window, it is revealed that the Nazis have exploded an atomic bomb in Washington, D.C. The show then jumps to the present bombing scene. Decapitated bodies fill the streets of the Kempeitai building. A medical team works anxiously inside a trauma center nearby. Meanwhile, Inspector Kaido sits inside a medical tent and observes the damage in shock. He watches Yashida's body taken along with the rest of the bodies. Since General Onada and other chiefs have been killed in the blast, an officer informs Kaido that he is now the ranking officer. Meanwhile, Tagomi wanders around the rubble of the blast with a dazed expression on his face. Kaido and Tagomi together observe the bodies lining the streets while they move inside. At the office, Tagomi shows Kaido a film as footage of an atomic bomb conducted by the Americans around the Marshall Islands plays in front of them. Both men know that the Japanese soldiers do not possess such a weapon. Yet the film holds the only hope of avoiding war with the Nazis. In the next scene, Chancellor Martin Huesman discusses his plans for world domination in his Berlin war room. They are now at war with Japan. Huesman coldly details the 3 stages of the plan. Phase 1 launches missiles at Pacific States' major cities like Seattle, San Francisco, San Diego, and Tokyo so that the Nazis could decimate the Japanese and take over their empire. Next, nuclear bombs would hit Los Angeles, Sacramento, and other major Japanese cities in North America and Asia. The plan also alerts the Nazis to be ready for Japanese attacks on Chicago and New York. Finally, Phase 3 includes a ground invasion, lasting an estimated 2 weeks. Afterwards, Joe voices his immorality of the entire plan to his father, the Chancellor. He then cites the unimaginable number of causalities just to achieve their version of the perfect world. Huesman looks at his son and notes that they must make the Nazis the master race. The elimination of all inferior races would lead to a better world. But Joe remains confused and stubborn about his father's operation to murder millions of people. At the Smith household, Thomas finally confronts his parents about his illness and wants to know what is really wrong with him. Smith tells his son the truth about his muscular dystrophy. Unfortunately, there is no cure. In a heartbreaking scene, Thomas says he is defective, thus unfit to live. While their parents are comforting their son, a phone call interrupts the tender moment. An officer from the airport has called Smith to inform him that Inspector Kaido has traveled to New York to see him. Following the phone call, Smith sends a car for Kaido. Next, Juliana stomps at the Resistance hangout. Since the Resistance has found out that the Nazi troops are after her, they plan to move her to a safe house. George tells Juliana that he knows about Thomas' illness. George is insistent when Juliana suggests they leave the poor boy alone. He details his plans to bring the powerful Nazi Smith down for hiding his son's illness before leaving the place. Meanwhile, the Resistance leader Susan delivers Juliana a message which is a picture of Karen. A man silently appears from the dark and strangles Juliana unexpectedly, but Juliana quickly fights him off and chokes Susan to death after an intense struggle. She then sprints out the door to meet George and demands him the footage of her conversation with Thomas, but George refuses her request, and desperate Juliana shoots him. Suddenly, things become more apparent, and the man in the High Castle's clip regarding George's death is coming true. Terrified, Juliana flees away from the scene. Back at the Smith household, Inspector Kaido has finally arrived to show Smith the film. Kaido insists that the Japanese didn't assassinate Hitler, and he doesn't want their countries to go to war over a lie. He then shares Heydrich's plan, and if a war occurred, Heydrich's men would be the only victors. Therefore, they are the ones who need to prevent such a disastrous future and conduct their duties responsibly to save both nations. Smith then asks Kaido to leave the film while Kaido aims to reach the Japanese embassy, as he prefers to die on Japanese soil. Unfortunately, Smith has no choice but to go straight to Berlin with the information. In the next scene, Huesman looks authoritative as he stands at the podium and prepares for his upcoming speech. Meanwhile, Smith appears on Joe's doorstep to persuade him to show his father the film. Although Joe is skeptical, Smith freely admits his guilt. As they talk, Smith reveals to Joe that Juliana is still alive. As Chancellor Huesman continues his preparation, Joe and Smith approach him. While the troops attempt to capture Smith, Joe stops them. The film is then played in front of them. Joe begs his father to stop his plans. Meanwhile, Smith pulls Heinrich Himmler aside and confesses the gigantic conspiracy, all orchestrated by Husemann to take power. Not only did he plan Hitler's death by poisoning, but also the attack on the Japanese crown prince. Soon after, Himmler arrests Husemann and Joe for high treason and notifies the German people about the betrayal. Smith looks out over the 100,000 people filling the room as Himmler pronounces him as the nation's hero. Smith steps up as the entire room salutes the first American to be saluted in German history. Thanks to the joint efforts of Tagomi, Kaido, and Smith, the war has been avoided for now. Meanwhile, Juliana finds herself in the neutral zone. While she listens to a news report detailing what we have just seen, she burns the recording of her conversation with Thomas. Suddenly, she sees Benson, the man in the high castle. The truth begins to emerge as they talk. Benson tells her that it was all his plan, and Juliana was film's central component. He tells her about the films and reveals that everyone else changes character in the films, except for her. He also states that he orchestrated George's murder to avoid war. This was the only way to keep George from stopping Smith from preventing the war. Juliana is overwhelmed with the truth and sobs as she no longer has anyone else. Benson asks her to come with him, and they go onto a picturesque dock. The girl is standing there. As she turns around, Juliana gasps. It's Trudy. To end the season finale, Tagomi stands up from his meditation to answer his door. Outside, Juliana's friend, Lem, delivers a container of films to Tagomi. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and hit that like button to help our channel grow. Turn on the notifications so you won't miss any of our new videos. Thanks for watching.